started so we can have plenty of time at the end of the service so people won't have to stand up outside. Today we're in the book of Genesis. We've been in the book of Genesis for this next week will be our 20th week. And next week we will finish up the book of Genesis. And I know y'all are probably saying, boy, I wish he'd hurry up and finish up the book of Genesis. But next week we will finish it up. But today, to review where we're at, today's lesson is about Joseph. And we're in Genesis chapter 42. But Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob. And Joseph, of course, was special to Jacob because Joseph was his firstborn son with his favorite wife, Rachel. And remember that he had worked 14 years for the hand of Rachel in marriage. But, Joseph being the favorite, there's problems when that goes on. Favoritism over one child over another just don't work out. And Joseph's 10 older brothers became envious and jealous of Joseph, and they became jealous of his standing with Jacob, and so they got so mad that they sold him into slavery to a group of Midianite traders for 20 shekels of silver, which in that day and time was 80 days' wages. And so there was 10 of them, so that would be they sold him into slavery for about 8 days' wages apiece. And so the brothers put goat's blood on Joseph's coat of many colors that Jacob had made for Joseph. And they told Jacob that an animal had killed Joseph. And the Midianite traders then went to Egypt and they sold Joseph to a man named Potiphar, an Egyptian captain of the guard named Potiphar. And he worked for Potiphar 11 years. He worked for Potiphar for 2 years. And Potiphar could see that God was really working in his life. And so Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his entire estate. But also the Bible tells us that Joseph was a good-looking young man, and it caught the eye of Potiphar's wife. And when Joseph refused to sleep with her, she made up a false story, and Joseph was put into prison. And while in prison, Joseph correctly interpreted the cupbearer and the baker's dream. The cupbearer recommended Joseph to the Pharaoh after nobody else could interpret the Pharaoh's dream. And so Joseph, through God's intervention, correctly interpreted the Pharaoh's dream. And the Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph that he gave Joseph this high position. It actually was the second highest position in Egypt. It was in charge over the food supply, which is very important in that day, and it's important today also. But only the Pharaoh could overrule Joseph's authority, and that's where we pick up in today's lesson. We pick up in today's lesson, chapter 42, verse 6. And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he was it that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And so in chapter 41, verse 57 describes a famine that had come into the world. And it had engulfed the known world at that particular time. Not only was Egypt in a famine, but also the land of Canaan was also in that same famine. And because God had given Joseph the wisdom to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams, Egypt had plenty of grain stored up. And so Jacob in Canaan decided to send his 10 oldest boys to Egypt to buy some grain. And it had been more than 20 years since the brothers had sold Joseph into slavery. And verse 42, verse 6 tells us that Joseph was in charge of the country's food supply. And Joseph had the authority to sell grain not only to the Egyptians, but to foreigners. And the brothers came and they didn't recognize Joseph, and they bowed down before him. And Joseph remembered over 20 years earlier that he had a dream that would reveal this very same scene of these brothers bowing down before him. And in verse 7, Joseph immediately knew his brothers, but they didn't know him because the brothers were older than Joseph, and the last time they saw him, Joseph was 17 years old. And they didn't recognize him because Joseph was wearing a high-ranking Egyptian clothing. He also spoke to them in a harsh manner, in a manner that a high-ranking official would speak to somebody that had come to him for help. And Joseph decided to play ignorant. He decided that in order to find out, he wanted to find out more about how his present-day brothers, what their attitude was today. Because the last time he saw them, their attitude was pretty bad because they sold him into slavery, even though he was pleading not to be sold into slavery. Then in verse 9, and Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of, and said unto them, Ye are spies, to see the nakedness of the land ye are come. And so Joseph remembered that, he remembered everything. He remembered that he had had a dream where his brothers were going to be bowing down to him. And now he wanted to test the sincerity of their bowing down. I mean, you can bow down to something without being sincere about it, and because it was the custom of that day. And so he wanted to test their sincerity, and so Joseph said, You're spies, that you've come to Egypt because we're weak right now because of the famine, and you've come to spy out the land for maybe a possible invasion. And of course, Joseph had the power. He didn't need to make up anything. He had the power as being the second in command in Egypt. He had the power to seek revenge right then and there if he wanted to. But he didn't want to do that. He wanted to mend their broken relationship if it was possible, but he was not going to mend it if their attitude was still like, we're going to sell you into slavery. And so Joseph sincerely wanted to mend the relationship, but he had to find out their sincerity first. Then in verses 13 and 14, the brothers humbly referred to themselves as servants because they're talking to a high-ranking official. And they wanted to convince this Egyptian official that they were not there to spy out the land. They were not there to look for the weaknesses so that they could invade it or anything like that. They said they were they were sons of a man who had 12 sons. And then they told Joseph that there were 10 there, and then they had a younger brother at home. And then they said, one is not. Meaning, and Joseph knew exactly who the one is not, because that was him. And meaning one brother had died or he had gone from the family. And then in verse 14, Joseph repeated, You're spies, to further make the brothers explain himself. And Joseph he really wanted to know about his younger brother Benjamin. And Rachel, his mother, had only 2 sons, and that was Joseph and Benjamin. And so at the time Joseph left, Benjamin was just about 4 years old. And then in verse 15, Hereby ye shall prove by the life of Pharaoh, ye shall not go forth hence, except your youngest brother come hither. And so Joseph said, You're not going to leave this place unless you agree to bring your younger brother to Egypt. And he wanted to see Benjamin, and Joseph's mother, as I said, was Rachel. And Rachel had died at age 36, giving birth to Benjamin. And so, she led 36 is pretty young for that day and time. But later on in history, Genesis 46:21 tells us gives us Benjamin's family tree. And Benjamin himself had 10 sons, and his lineage included King Saul, and it also included Mordecai. And Mordecai was, remember, he was the guardian of Queen Esther. And when the nation split up, the southern kingdom was made up of the descendants of Judah and Benjamin. And so, but here Benjamin's just a child. He's probably about four years old when Joseph was sold into slavery. And so Joseph wanted to see what Benjamin had turned out to be. He wanted to know if he turned out to be as evil as his brothers had been. And in verses 16 and 17, Joseph wanted to know the character of his brothers. And so he devised a plan. He was going to put them to the test. And Joseph said, 1 brother will return to Canaan to get Benjamin, and the other 9 will be imprisoned. And Joseph wanted to see how his brothers would handle adversity, because we all have adversity in this life, no doubt about that. And early in Joseph's life, he'd had a lot of adversity, but he also knew that adversity had made him the person that he was today. And the brothers, he wanted to see if their brothers could handle adversity. And so Joseph really wanted to reconcile with his brother, and he wanted to test the character. So verse 17 says, the first thing he did is he put all 10 of them in prison for 3 days. and he wanted to see how they would react to that. And in verse 21, after he put him in jail for 3 days, the brothers, they began to do what he thought they would do. They began to reflect on their life, and they remembered their sin of dealing with their brother Joseph, and they remembered selling him into slavery. And they reasoned, it says, it is plain that we are being punished for what we did to our brother. And so they come to that realization, and each one of them admitted guilt. And then they remembered Joseph. They remembered Joseph as they were selling him into slavery. They remembered his deep distress as he pleaded with them. But they didn't listen. They refused to listen. And there's an old saying that says, we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. And that's true. When we fail, we try to look for a reason that we failed, and we try to look for what went wrong, and we do some reflection on it. But for some reason, when we do something successful, we celebrate, and that's it. We think, well, we must be doing something right, or it wouldn't come out right. And we don't learn anything from it because we didn't suffer anything from it. But when a person is suffering, you try to look back over your life and find out why. What has brought you to this point? In verse 22, and Reuben answered them, saying, Spake I not unto you, saying, Do not sin against this child, and you would not hear. Therefore, behold, also his blood is required. And so Reuben was Jacob's firstborn son. He was the oldest. And Reuben began to talk, and he remembered how he had told his brothers not to harm the boy. At that time, Reuben's plan was to throw Joseph into an empty pit, which is called a cistern. It was dry. And then he was going to later return and remove Joseph to give Joseph some time to remember. Remember, Joseph had told them about his dream of them bowing down to him, and that made them mad. Then he told him about his dream where not only they would bow down, but his father and his mother would bow down, and that made them madder. And so they were mad at him, and Reuben was mad at him, but Reuben wanted just to teach him a lesson and then come and get him out of that pit. But the other brothers, while Reuben was gone, the other brothers sold him to the group of Midianite traders, and this is one of those I told you also things, but this is basically what he said. He's saying that, I told you that was going to happen, and this is the end result. This is the end result of what we did. And then in verse 23, they had been speaking to Joseph through an interpreter. So they're in jail, they're talking to one another, and Joseph is by listening. And when they've got something to say, the interpreter will say it to Joseph. But Joseph could understand everything they were saying. They thought that he couldn't. And so by this way, Joseph was getting their actual feelings. And so these brothers, they were admitting to their wrongdoing, and that's what Joseph wanted to hear from them anyway. He wanted to know if they had any remorse for selling him into slavery, and they did. And so verse 24 tells us, And he turned himself about from them and wept, and returned to them again, and communed with them, and took from them Simeon, and bound him before their eyes. And so Joseph had been through 13 years of slavery. He now had been he was put in prison 2 years, and then he spent another 7 years serving the Pharaoh as the Pharaoh's top official. And so the emotions here of hearing the true feelings of how his brothers felt about him caused him to turn away and cry. He didn't want to cry in front of them because he was not ready to reveal himself to them yet. But his tears were a desire to be reunited with his family, because he knew that his family worshiped the only true and living God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And he also knew, God had let him know that God was going to forge this nation out of those brothers, and they were going to be able to show the characteristics of God to the rest of the world. And so these brothers, each one of those brothers, are going to be instrumental in forming the nation of Israel. And then, of course, Galatians 4:4 says, "But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law." And so it was the job of Israel to reflect God's character to the world. But Jesus' job was much more than just a reflection. Jesus is and was God. And so Jesus revealed God's character perfectly. Israel reflected God's character the best that they could through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But Jesus was God and is God, and he perfectly revealed God. But here in verses 29 through 38, the 9 brothers, except for Simeon, it says, returned home to Jacob, and they explained to Jacob that the man in charge of Egypt wanted us to leave one brother behind and come and get our youngest brother and bring him back to Egypt. And he said, by this way, we can prove that we're not spies looking to overthrow Egypt or looking to attack Egypt for food. And of course, Jacob did not want to send his youngest son, Benjamin. But Reuben, the oldest, said, "You can slay my 2 sons if I don't bring him back to you." But of course, that didn't satisfy Jacob. Jacob didn't want somebody to say, "I'll slay somebody else." You know, this would be a tragedy on a tragedy if he had to slay two more sons, or grandsons. So verse 43 tells us that Jacob finally sent his sons, including Benjamin, back to Egypt for food after Judah convinces Jacob by promising him, "I'll be personally responsible." So he's not telling him that somebody else, you can harm somebody else if he don't come back. He's telling him, "I'll be personally responsible. And if I don't bring him back in return, then, I'm putting my life on the line." And so that satisfied Jacob that one son was going to take personal responsibility and offer his life for the life of Benjamin if it came right down to it. And of course it did come right down to it. But so the brothers, they returned to Egypt with gifts and double money to buy grain, and the brothers are brought this time before Joseph's house, where Joseph prepared a feast for them. And they sat down in the order of their birth, and he gave Benjamin a portion 5 times larger than the others. And so Joseph was very glad to see the Benjamin, and verse 30 said he entered into his chamber and wept. And then we pick up in verse 1 of chapter 44, and Joseph is still not convinced, plus he wants to test Benjamin also. He's still not convinced of their sincerity. And so we pick up in chapter 44, verse 1. "And he commanded the steward of his house, saying, Fill the men's sack with food, as much as they can carry, and put every man's money back in his sack's mouth." And so chapter 44, when the brothers arrived, Joseph continued to test the brothers' sincerity. And he told his steward to fill the men's sacks with much food as they could carry. And he also told them to put the money back in the bags because he was not going to charge them for the food. But also Joseph was going to set up a trap here. He told his steward to put Joseph's silver cup at the top of the youngest boy's bag. In other words, he put this silver cup after he put the food in. He didn't put the cup in and cover it up with food. He put the cup where it could be seen at the top of the bag. And Joseph was setting up a trap whereby he could accuse Benjamin of stealing his silver cup. And Joseph could see then how his older brothers would respond to Benjamin being put in jail. And Joseph wanted to reconcile with his brothers, but first he wanted to make sure of not only their character, but also of Benjamin's character. And then in verse 32, Joseph carries out his plan. "For thy servant became surely for the lad unto my father, saying, If I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever." And of course, this is Judah speaking. And when Joseph accused Benjamin of taking the silver cup, Judah came to Benjamin's aid, which is what he was hoping for anyway. And remember, Judah was the brother that actually sold Joseph into slavery. I mean, he was the head one that recommended it, and they couldn't talk him out of it. And so Judah had sold Joseph into slavery. Also, Judah was the one who convinced Jacob to let Benjamin go back to Egypt and told him, I'll be personally responsible for him. And so Benjamin got into trouble by being accused of taking the silver cup, of course, which he didn't do. And Judah then told Joseph that he was accountable to Jacob for the boy. And then in verse 33, now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondsman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren. And so Judah said, let me serve you as a slave in place of Benjamin, and let Benjamin and the other brothers return to Canaan. And Judah's words were music to Joseph's ears, because that's exactly what he wanted to hear, because it proved that Judah's character had changed. He had changed from selling him into slavery, because Joseph pleaded with Judah not to sell him into slavery, but he sold him anyway. But here now, he's changed. And not only that, but he's willing to give his life for his brother's life. And Judah said his father would be overwhelmed with grief if Benjamin did not return. And then we pick up in chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And so verse 1 tells us is all about reconciliation. And of course today, when two people have a falling out, pride usually gets in the way. And for some reason today, there's a lot of pride in the United States because, as we talked about at the very first, the divorce rate is unreal. And most of it is because of the prideful nature of reconciliation, that nobody's willing to give in. Nobody's willing to concede to other people's needs. But both parties have to be sensitive to the needs of the other. And that just has to happen in every marriage. I mean, nobody gets their own way all the time. It's a give and take. And here Joseph was willing to give and take. He really wanted to be reconciled with his brothers, but he wanted to test his brothers first. But here Joseph was willing to get past that if his brothers were willing to get past that. And Joseph was sure that his brothers, especially Judah, had changed. And so Joseph could no longer keep his composure, as these next few verses tell us that as the attendants, he sent the attendants out of the room, and there was only him and his brothers now left in the room. And Joseph then revealed himself. He revealed his identity to the brothers. And in verses 2 and 3, Joseph began to weep, and he began to speak so loudly that even people in the next room could hear him, as he revealed to his brothers that I am Joseph, the one you sold into slavery. And they were in disbelief, and also because he spoke so loudly, it scared them. And next, Joseph asked about Jacob, his father, but the brothers were too scared. They were too terrified to answer him, because Joseph was so emotional and so loud when he told them that it scared them. And in verses 4, and Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into slavery. And so he could see the terror in their eyes, and so he called them to him again a second time, because the first time they were too frightened to realize what was going on. He told them to come near to him, and he told them again that he was the brother that they had sold into slavery. But they also added, in the next few verses, don't be worried or angry or with yourself, because he said, God has sent me here. It was God's will that Joseph be at this place at this time, because there was a severe famine in the world, And Joseph was going to play a big part of not only helping them, but helping all these people that needed food. And so Joseph could see how he began to fit into God's plans. Not only was he reconciling with his brothers, but also he was helping a lot of people in the world. And then in verse 6, for these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And so Joseph at this time was 39 years old. He was 17 when he got sold into slavery. It had been 22 years, and from the time his brother sold him into slavery until this point in Joseph's life. And the land had been in a drought for 2 years. And so that meant that there was another 5 more years of the famine, because that was the Pharaoh's dream. He was going to have 7 good years. You were supposed to put back food because there was 7 bad years coming. And so he was in the second year of the 7 bad years. So there was 5 more years of famine on the way. And so in verse 7, Joseph told his brothers this was all part of God's plan for Joseph to be in Egypt at this particular time, to take care of not only the people of Egypt, but also the people of the land of Canaan, also of his family. And Joseph said, this is the beginning of God's plan. God's going to take this remnant through Joseph, through you, and grow it into a large nation of Israel. And this was going to require great miracles on God's part. It was going to require great deliverance on God's part, but not to worry, because it was all part of God's will. And then in verses 8 and 9, Joseph said that God has made me the father, or advisor. By father he meant advisor to the Pharaoh of Egypt, a ruler over all of the land of Egypt. And God allowed Joseph to hold this high position so God could carry out his plan to fruition of the nation of Israel. Next, Joseph told his brothers he desired to see his father again. And so he asked them to go back and get Jacob and bring him, because he said there's going to be 5 more years of famine. And you can bring him here and everything's going to be fine. And then in verse 14, and he fell upon his brother's Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. And so Joseph threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And then he not only did that for Benjamin, he also wept with his other brothers. And also he hadn't seen his younger brother for 22 years. And so it was a great emotional reunion. And Joseph wanted them to understand that he was forgiving all of them. And so upon each neck he kissed, and he wept. And then, of course, we realize in Romans 12:18 said, if possible, on your part, live at peace with everyone. And that kind of sums up the situation. If possible, we as Christians, we are to go the peaceful route, and we're not to let pride get in the way. Of course, we know that doesn't always happen, but we have to be able to reflect on that and get past that. Everybody has to get past their pride. Pride goeth before the fall, it says. And that has to be that way. You can't let pride ruin your life. You have to get past that. And we're human. Everybody has problems, but we're to work them out. And that Romans 12:18 says, if possible, on your part, live at peace with everyone. And that's what we're supposed to do as Christians. And that's what today's lesson is really, really all about. It's about reconciliation and the effort and the willing to forgive that brings that about. It just doesn't happen just because you want it to happen. You have to be willing to put forth an effort. God always does his part, but we have to be willing to do our part also. And that's just part of it. We got any comments or questions on today's lesson? Went by pretty quick, but we want to end up a little bit. Well, I wanted to end up a little bit earlier than this so that we could talk with people coming in, but I guess we run out of time a little bit later than I thought we would.